Thanks, Saul. I'm going to take a cue from Richard here and use this handy podium. Like all the speakers, I had a conversation with Saul prior to coming down here. And Saul gave some sort of mixed signals. He said, you have to tell a personal story, but it's got to be about transformational system-level change. And all I could think of was The Fly, whether Jeff Goldblum or Vincent Price, take your generational choice. But I do want to actually talk about DNA change, but in an economic sense. But a handy example came up. This is Monday's New York Times. China and India making inroads in biotech drugs. They've been able to make pharmaceuticals, but not biotech drugs. So it says, drug makers, China and India, on the verge of selling cheaper copies of such huge sellers as Herceptin. Everybody know what Herceptin is? It's a powerful drug for breast cancer. Very, very effective, very important to a segment of the population. So what is the Times reporter's take on this? The entry could not only transform the care of patients, but also ignite a counterattack, interesting word, counterattack on the care of patients by major pharmaceutical companies whose job is what? Care of patients, and diplomats from richer countries. So I want you to ask yourself, how do you think this attack, this war, is going to come out? And we'll come back to that question. But I do want to spend a minute on the personal story that leads me to the answer to it. In the spring of 2008, with things looking kind of dicey, but Lehman Brothers still intact, some editors from Harvard Business Review came over and said, hey, things are looking kind of dicey. What do you think is going to happen next? And I said, well, I don't really have a clue, but in fact, why are you asking me? And they said, because you have told us before in an unguarded moment that your personal mission is to anticipate and shape the future of business. Now, this is something I don't usually acknowledge because it sounds pretty pretentious and hubristic, but it's true. So I said, okay, well, I don't know what's going to happen in 2008, but I know how I would find out. I have a theory of change for capitalism, and that is that capitalism evolves. I've studied adaptive systems. Duncan Watts was a big hero of mine in the mid-90s. And you can think of capitalism as a set of rules that a society adopts for trading with one another and creating value. And if you think it's a set of rules, then it's a little bit like a genome. And if you think it's like a genome, then its environment will select certain rules as fit and certain rules as less fit. Now, what happens when a species moves to a different environment? The genome changes because the environment selects for different genes. So capitalism is moving. It's moving from slow-growing, aging, high-income societies, like the United States, to rapidly growing, youthful, low-income societies like India and China and Bangladesh and many others. And so it stands to reason that that genome is going to shift. That capitalism, the organism we think of as capitalism, is going to be different after a while. So what would that tell us? Well, you would expect survival of the fittest is a watchword of evolution, and so you would expect that capitalism's evolution will always come up with the best rules. But it turns out that sometimes biology gets it wrong. And I want to tell you the fable and reality of the peacock's tail. Where did that thing come from? So it turns out it's the peahens, folks, that the tail, originally a sign of health in the bird, attracts opportunities to mate, and that for peahens, size matters, that the peacock with the larger tail gets more opportunities to mate than the peacock with the shorter tail. So what happens? The species, on average, grows a longer and longer and longer tail, and you get this beautiful thing. Problem. That sexual selection leads to adverse natural selection. Why? Because this thing is expensive. This is the Ferrari of mating ornaments. And it's expensive to grow it in terms of food budget. It's expensive to maintain it. And it slows you down so that honey badger or something is going to get a hold of you more easily than it could before. So longer tails, fewer peacocks. And this is called the runaway effect by biologists, when sexual selection on too narrow a criterion runs away with natural selection, and the species is less adaptive, less fit than it ought to be. Now, what might this look like in economics? By the way, this is sometimes called biological suicide. So let me show you some economic suicide. Oops. Yeah. 1912. An engineer graduates from Virginia Tech named Donaldson Brown and goes to work for DuPont. By about 1918, DuPont takes a big position in General Motors, which was in trouble at the time, imagine that. And Donaldson Brown is sent, who is no longer the explosive salesman he was hired to be, but is now a financial guy, is sent down to be treasurer of DuPont and to sort this place out. And he does some engineering work, and he comes up with what has been known ever since as the DuPont Equation, which I will tell you I think of as the master rule of industrial capitalism. This is as deep in our genome, our economic genome, as anything. What does it say? Well, first of all, it puts return on equity on the left-hand side, because in the 1920s, nothing was scarcer than equity capital. There were all these opportunities to build industrial companies. They were all expensive because these were large-scale, steel mills and auto factories. So getting equity was the thing you were trying to optimize on. And he made a simple observation. You can just do the arithmetic and say, if you take your return on sales times your sales on assets times your assets to equity ratios, you get return on equity, right? You just cancel, and it's a tautology. So what? Well, the revelation in the DuPont equation was it gave the functional organizations a mission, a selection criterion, if you like. So what it led to was the creation of incentives in companies, and then you'll get a social reaction. Let me show you what I mean. So if you're a marketer, I can tell you your job is to maximize return on sales, maximize margin. And it doesn't take you too long to figure out that Adam Smith's form of competition is not so good for that, because Adam Smith says competition brings down margin. So what you want is market power. And you go after it, and you create the trusts, and you get the 1920s, an era of great monopolies, until we get antitrust law. So market power begins to be a runaway, but it's curbed by the society. Similarly, sales to assets, you want to get the most out of your plant. You are perfectly willing to abuse your labor to do it. You have 3 shifts. People are interchangeable. Eventually, we get unions and labor laws in reaction. And assets to equity, you take more financial risk to get more leverage. You should have gotten some societal reaction, but instead we had the Depression, and then we got one. And in case we weren't too sure about that, we repealed the legislation, and we got another recession. So that's pretty reliable. Point being, these runaways can be curbed by social reaction, but where we are right now is in a world of runaway financial incentives. And the larger point that I want to make is, the technology that was being exploited in the first half of the 20th century didn't come from the United States. It came, that's the University of Edinburgh, where Watt was, where Maxwell was. Tremendous development. It was the Silicon Valley of its day. But the rules for running a society founded on that technology were developed in the youthful, rapidly growing, low-income society of the United States. So where are we now? We've had our Silicon Valley. We have a new technology. It's spreading all over the world. Are we the G7 countries, the rich countries, going to make the rules for how this next form of economics takes shape? And the answer to that is no. It's going to take shape in places like India and China and the rest of them. So I spent a couple of years looking around in the emerging economies trying to see what kind of rules would take shape there. And in case you doubt the power of these economies, I know you will nod that they are the powerful economic engines, but today the rich world is 75% of consumption, 2050, 32%. Today, you can already see the decline. This is where the 2,500 largest companies in the world are headquartered, and US, Canada, Western Europe are already in decline. They are going to be run by women like Sweta Mangal, who I interviewed, and she told me when she was working at Pratt & Whitney, as she had been, that life was so boring. You got up, you went to work, you did your work, you came home, you cooked your food, you ate your food, you watched television, you did it again, and everything worked perfectly, and it was so boring because she had grown up in a place where nothing worked. And so she left, went back to India because she thought she could do something there. And what she did is found the first ambulance service in Mumbai. Studying what was going on in India led me to the first of 6 rules that are in a book coming out in February called Standing on the Sun. I'll only deal with one rule, which I call seeing in color, because seeing only the financial side of life is like seeing the world in black and white. And we've heard countless BIF speakers talk about seeing a broader sense of value. And even on Facebook, there is now a Facebook happiness project. And the leader of that project says, if we know money doesn't buy happiness, why are we optimizing for money? It's a very simple, very important question. One of the reasons is during that depression that we had in the 30s, we figured out what measurements we wanted to use, and we developed the measurement of GDP. Before that, we didn't have that. So once we had the measure, it was easy to optimize. We've spent most of a century working on that basis. But now people are developing new measures. This is a chart from the Legatum Institute's Prosperity Index. And note that economy at the top is only one of 8 classes of value that they measure as components of prosperity. And notice that in comparing, in this case, South Korea, New Zealand, and Malaysia, the differences are not about economy or even entrepreneurship and opportunity. They're at 2 o'clock, but much more about personal freedom and social capital. And once you start to measure something, that feedback starts to do something. And what happens is there gets to be no place to hide because data is available to examine what's going on. And you have a choice if you're, say, a company, to act like the cigarette companies, which are still fighting the case that they shouldn't have to, for example, restrict advertising tobacco. But more recently, that's been going on for 30 years. In the last decade, the food companies, when they heard that trans fats were harmful, said, okay, let's get out in front of this, reformulated their products, and trans fats have essentially been taken out of the US industrial food chain. So that, to me, is evidence that this idea of feedback changing the behavior from a purely financial-based to a value-based choice can happen even in the advanced economies. So the challenge that I and Julia Kirby, who's my co-author for this book, set ourselves is, what would be the new master equation for this next form of capitalism? And this is truly a BIF message, because it's all about innovation. And it says that what we ought to maximize is growth, defined as the change in value over time. Whether we end up with a prosperity index or something else, we mean value beyond financial. And that's equal to the change in value from an innovation, of an innovation for each person using it. Let's take Herceptin as a highly valuable innovation for the people who use it, times the breadth of applicability of that innovation, times the frequency of innovation over time, whether you're a person, a company, a society. that this is the way we will learn to grow value going forward. And I want to end with an example of a company, because what do you do when you have a theory? You go out and look for proof. And somewhat surprisingly to me, GE Healthy Imagination is a pretty interesting case study. Surprisingly to me because, of course, GE is not a perfect company. They were dumping PCBs in the Hudson for a long time. It's not, they are not a benighted company with regard to sustainability historically. But in their health business, they've said, here are a couple of strategies. Number one, we understand that this market is going to be in a different income class globally. So we're going to have more products at more prices in order to reach more people for each of our innovations, right? And the way we're going to do that is we'll take our 1,000 engineers in India and China, and instead of having them work on products for Europe and the United States and the rest of the world, we'll have them work on products in country, for country. So we're going to learn to reach more people in more places at more price points. This is the MAC-I, an electrocardiogram developed for India. And a couple of interesting things about it. It had to be 1/10 of the price of the $5,000 machine used in the West. In order to do that, you needed a machine that could survive on the back of a scooter going down a dusty road to a place where there was no power, right? So that's not the model sold in Switzerland. Right? So they did things like use the printer used at Indian railroad stations because there are many of them, and people know how to repair them, but also they're cheap. So all of this said, they made a $500 machine instead of a $5,000 machine. So I'm going to take 2 more minutes, okay? But there's another twist on this, and that is that the $5,000 machine and the $500 machine use the same software. So you have this learning system that gets updated like you're updating your operating system, that learns from what's going on in India, learns from what's going on eventually in Africa, learns from what's going on at the Mayo Clinic, and everybody gets the benefit of that simultaneously. 40% of these machines are now sold in Europe, so the price on average of an EKG in Europe is going down too. So GE is taking steps that provide more innovations per time, because the world's learning happens everywhere, for more people in more countries, and certainly what they're doing has high value per person. So it's one company that suggests this notional equation could be helpful. There's one other way in which it's helpful, and there's an audio clip from Aswin Varghese, who was one of the developers. Can we just hear that, please?
I completely agree. I mean, the motivation and inspiration and the willingness to come to work every day and just drive hard with passion is driven with the fact that you are affecting lives of millions of people in your own country and in other countries who are not having affordable access to healthcare.
Byron said today, work is not the opposite of play. Aswin has gone from working at developing things for somebody else to something that feels like great engagement, looking like that brain lit up with engagement for his work in India. And I think what this is telling us is that it is inevitable that how this story is going to end. More people are going to get value from reorganizing capitalism in a way that favors the patient over favoring the company. Now, when I asked you to think about it before, did you think about which way you thought it would come out? How many people thought the corporate regime would win out? I'm just curious. Not too many. Well, a few. Anyhow, I think not because it's political or my own sort of spiritual belief about it, but because economic analysis and understanding how evolution will work on the genome of capitalism suggests to me this is the direction it's going to go. We're going to form a view of capitalism that measures all kinds of value. We're going to break the grip of the runaway financial focus. And that's my anticipation. If I've shaped anybody's view, then I've done something to shape the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.